It's now time for this month's broadcast of Learning Now TV.
It's the end of April already, and we're rushing into our second programme as we welcome in May. I think I've gone a bit crazy now that I can see pubs may be opening at some point in the near future. Kind of makes you slightly wild. Anyway, Kate, we've got a great programme. Tell us who's on it.
Well, yet again, we are dominated by women in learning, which obviously delights me this week. I had the pleasure of speaking to Dana James Edwards about her really important work around equity, diversity and inclusion in the space. You spoke to Becky Norman of Training Zone about their culture
Pioneers, cultural pioneers.
That's it. And we bid a fond farewell, a kind of exit interview, if you will, for a great servant of the L&D community, Debbie Carter from Training Journal.
Yes, so the whole of this century, Debbie's been editing Training Journal. So yes, it is a fond farewell and an optimistic farewell as well. So we've also got our regular contributors. Shall we say on with the show, Kate?
On with the show. I'm absolutely delighted to welcome our next guest to Learning Now Television. Dana James Edwards is an equity, diversity and inclusion specialist. She's somebody that I've been fortunate enough to work with twice now in the last couple of months, but somebody whose kind of meteoric profile I've watched grow and grow, particularly in the last 12 months. We've had a lot of mutual connections for a long time. So thank you for coming on the show, Dana.
Thanks for inviting me, Kate. You know, I always welcome the opportunity to work with you.
And I think we could fill the whole programme probably. So we're going to have to try and keep it focused for the next 10 minutes or so. But I mean, obviously, for me, you know, we kind of reached each other through the kind of the work that I do around women in learning. The whole kind of area that you work on, I passionately believe in the importance of that and the role that learning and development, obviously as a profession, has to play in that. So can you tell us a little bit more about what you do day to day and how you help organisations with this important stuff?
So learning and development is part of the equation, but not the whole equation. I think it's part of a solution that is provided, but not the entire story. So I can do things like help companies shape their strategies and policy. So starting at the base level from ground zero. We can also help validate some things. So having data is really important in this space, not great to make assumptions. So clients can say, here's where we think a problem is, here's what we think an issue is, but they need an external set of eyes to help them validate those truths. I can help with that. In some ways, I embed myself within organizations to help review their processes, give a fresh lens on things, but also part of my job is telling the truth. And sometimes when you work within an organization, telling the truth to people who you respect and admire feels really difficult. Having an external person do some of that truth telling does lift the burden. So I'm happy to support in that way. I also lately have been doing lots of C-suite level and senior executive coaching one-on-one. I think when you're a senior leader, you want to get everything right, you know, you want to display the right messages, but sometimes you don't understand, you need some context, and it's really difficult to be able to own up to that in a room full of eyes that are upward looking. So having some support behind the scenes is really useful, and I do that as well.
It's encouraging to hear that, actually, because I was talking to Nigel recently about how everybody should have a mentor or a coach, no matter how senior. So it's really great to think that there are leaders out there recognizing where their gaps are or what they don't know, and you know, coming to somebody like yourself to help fill those gaps.
It's been happening more and more, and I'm very encouraged by it.
Good. It is encouraging, and it does feel to me, I mean, obviously we have all had, one hell of a year, but in the wake of the George Floyd killing and the rise of the Black Lives Matter movement, we were talking before we came online about the Stop Asian Hate movement. It feels very much like the diversity piece is really, really in the spotlight at the moment. And it's not to say that obviously it hasn't been important previously, but I don't know, is that something that is reflected in what you're seeing for demand and how organizations are trying to tackle this stuff? It suddenly feels like it's really top of the agenda.
So I feel like the world has finally caught up to where I've always been in terms of my thinking about diversity and inclusion. For me, it has always been important. I think people are starting to wake up to the reality of what's around them. And some of it, of course, is people's caring and passion and lived experiences for the world around them. But some of it from an organizational perspective is that line in the sand of people saying, look, we're going to work with vendors, we're going to choose suppliers, we're going to choose partners who have bases that are reflective of the wider world around us. It's people waking up to the fact that they're being outpaced by competitors who have better diversity and diversity of thought than they do. It's the numbers around what diversity and inclusion mean in terms of profits, in terms of staff retention, in terms of recruitment. And so, yes, I would like to think people are altruistic and want to do the right thing. And to some degree, that may be true. But it's also true that the benefits of it have been studied more. People are able to make better links and correlations to performance and diversity. And as a result, now it's top of mind. I'm hopeful, Kate, that it stays that way. That is my genuine hope. And I'm going to work to keep it front of mind. I hope this isn't a passing phase, but I don't think it will be, just because of what I see and know from the younger generations, especially starting to make choices about where they work based on the profile of the organization, how they represent themselves, how they come across in the world. And so I think that pressure is going to remain there, that impetus to be better and to do better. And I welcome it.
But, how do you really go about helping to change hearts and minds and educate people? Because a lot of people, they don't know what they don't know. But,
Absolutely.
I think we're probably all in agreement that a piece of clip next e-learning is not, it can help educate, but it's not really necessarily going to change that behavior. So, how do you like to come at this topic, and how do you help organizations start to tackle it?
So I love that question, Kate. And I think my first point is that now I am lucky enough in my career to be able to say no to jobs where the companies that are trying to work with me think it's a tick box, where they think, okay, let's do 1 3-hour unconscious bias session or 1 2-hour unconscious bias session, and all of our problems will be solved forevermore, right? That's not how the world works. And so for me, I challenge that. And I think that the clients who ultimately do decide to go ahead and work with me know that more is expected, and actually have a thinking and a program behind it. They have already planned ahead for how they're going to keep things front of mind. A piece of training might be part of a wider agenda. They're trying multiple approaches beyond just a training session. They're not doing just e-learning, and they are doing more. I think, yes, fine, start with a training session, but don't let that be the one thing that you aim to do for the year. I also think that as organizations set strategies and objectives around D&I, an objective can't be have 1 D&I training session for the year, because you know what's going to happen. You're going to have that one, and then you're going to move on. I also feel that key to this is conversation. And so, okay, you want to start with a quick e-learning to get everyone up to speed. It hurts my heart, but I'll let you have it. But somewhere along the line, there must be conversations. There must be understanding, meeting of the minds, people being able to express themselves, people being able to ask questions in real time and get answers to those questions, but also without fear of judgment and reprisals and being looked down on. So I hope that as we start the process of moving out of virtual, we start thinking about how some of the beauty of virtual can be taken back to the physical world. Because what I've noticed over the last few months is how people have been empowered to start conversations and to ask questions because of anonymity. So on a Zoom call, for example, you could send a direct message to me as your facilitator. Only I see it. I don't have to attribute it to anyone. Mm-hmm. I can answer your question. You can get what you need in the session without emotionally displaying yourself. And that's something that we have to keep working at. It's about the safe spaces. It's about the conversation. It's about the relationship. But it's also about lived experience sharing. I feel that that's so important. And I've been watching it turn the dial again and again. So I know nobody owes the world their story. Absolutely no one does. And you do not have to dredge up your pain for the education of others. But some people choose to. I'm one of those people who choose to talk openly and freely. And I think that if people are giving you that gift, take the gift, right? Take the gift, learn more and immerse yourself in how you experience how someone else experiences the world. Because the way that you experience the world, Kate, the way that I experience the world is not the way that every single other person experiences the world. And I think the sooner that we can understand that, get to grips with it, the better that we will be in creating an inclusive world.
You're so eloquent. I can't really add to that. That's, the sentiment is spot on. And I think, it's really important. I mean, I see more and more on social media, people talking about, trigger warnings and things like that. So now we could talk for the rest of the hour, no problem, but Colin will tell me off. So if you could leave our viewers with, one or two tips if they're looking at what they do around diversity and inclusion and thinking it doesn't really come up to scratch or it doesn't really leap off the page, are there one or two things that they, other than contacting you, which I would recommend following Dana on all platforms. Instagram's colourful and informative, and every day I learn something new on a channel where I'm not necessarily there to learn. So I love that. But if you could leave our viewers with one or two things to think about, where should they start?
So the first thing I want to reinforce is the notion that learning in this space has to be classroom-based, right? Or requires extensive reading of 100 books. So I feel like every time I log onto social media, someone has a photo up of a book that they've read, and that's great, but it's not for everyone. So I would love to encourage people to take a step back and look at whether their learning in itself is inclusive. Are you offering multiple methods to people? Are you meeting people where they are? Are you providing options? Because there are so many options. There's podcasts, there's short snippets. I mean, let's not limit ourselves when we think about what learning in the inclusion space looks like. That's the first thing. Yeah. The second thing that I would encourage is thinking about where you are and what you're trying to solve. How have you decided that unconscious bias is the right thing to run now? How have you decided that this program was what was needed? And if it was needed then, how do we know that it's still needed now? It's about starting to ask yourself the questions about that body of work and really thinking about where you are. I also feel my last tip is about asking the people who you serve. So lots of times I go into organizations and they have these amazing plans and I say, well, how does the rest of the organization feel about it? And no one knows. because they haven't asked. But you are creating learning for these people. How could you not know how they feel about it, what's going to work for them, what they're looking forward to, right? You have access to them right at your fingertips. Use them and really build with them in mind.
I love it. Dana, amazing advice, amazing insight, always delivered with a smile and so much energy. It's absolutely, infectious. I love it. So hopefully we can get you back on the show again to talk about this, this important topic in more depth. But for now, thank you so much.
You're welcome. Thank you.
DPG's online courses are designed to fit around your life, so you can study anytime, anywhere. Get in touch now for more info.
I bet there are people astonished that Robin is back. That man is incredibly reliable and consistent. I don't think he's missed a program for maybe 2 years, something like that. Well, Robin's talking about learning transfer this time, and his focus is on what you have to do after some kind of learning intervention in order to ensure the transfer. Good stuff, really important, and we should pay attention to his wise words.
On Learning Now TV, I've made a number of contributions where I've talked about workplace transfer. So we shorten that to a TLA, of course, a 3-letter acronym of WPT, because, hey, we're in learning and development. We know how to make an acronym work. So what is it? Essentially, what workplace transfer is when we give people access to tools, job aids, perhaps specially designed tasks, which are there to help people use what they have learned into their workplace. Now, in my world, that typically follows a series of formal inputs, but there isn't actually a requirement that it does. It's just about creating a structure within which workplace activity happens following some sort of initiative. And one of the things that's quite important about the workplace transfer piece is that it needs to maintain a safe learning space, a safe psychological space for learning, as one of my heroes, Edgar Schein, would describe it, is when people feel it's okay to fail. So what we want to do with those tools, those job aids, those tasks that we give people is to ensure that they're not trying to bite off too much, and they're not trying to use those skills for the very first time when, hey, people are going to make mistakes. People are not going to get things right first time, every time, where there may be some risk associated with that. And it's about achieving a balance, isn't it? It's about ensuring that the rewards of developing the skills are not outweighed by the risks of not getting it right first time. So we want to create that safe space. And part of that safe space is also about the support that's around that individual. And that support comes from people. Now, it is possible for that support to be provided externally. So that might be a training provider, it might be the L&D department, it might be a business partner who is able to support those individuals on the job to do things differently and do different things. But there are some challenges with that, aren't there? The first is straightforward resourcing. It costs a lot of money to support individuals in the workplace to build those skills. And if that's being done by a learning and development department or by an external provider, then the bills start to rack up. The other thing is that we've got to be careful about is the Hawthorne Effect. So the Hawthorne Effect, for those of you who are unfamiliar with it, is a study done way back in the 50s, I think, when somebody was measuring the performance of people in the light switch factory. And what they found was whatever change was introduced, the performance went up. And then after a while, it dropped back down again and it stayed at the level it was at before. And what they actually found was that the reason that the performance went up was that there was somebody wearing a white coat and carrying a clipboard in the corner of the room watching people work. And so we don't want to create a false bounce of performance because people are aware that they are being monitored. We want people to be doing this as part of their day-to-day work in a day-to-day environment. And that means that we need what I call distributed capability. And distributed capability means that we support peers, we support coaches, we support line managers, team leaders to be able to provide the support. And that means that they need to know what good looks like. They need to know what the standards are that people should meet and what people should be doing. So that requires a separate level of engagement with the business and a separate level perhaps of learning interventions, which will enable those managers, peers, coaches to be able to support the initiative that we're on with. Now, recently, perhaps influenced by that potential additional activity that we're asking team leaders to do, I've found a number of clients are saying, well, can't we create a simulation version of the workplace transfer? Can't we give people the access to role plays? In one case, can't we create a virtual reality approach to enabling people to practice in real life? And certainly, you know, if I was training people to fly aircraft, I'd say, yeah, absolutely. If I was trying people to carry out surgery, I'd say, yeah, do that. Please do that. That would be a great idea. But I'm not. I'm training people to deal with their customers and their colleagues and to have meetings. And there's no real reason why we can't just learn that on the job to a certain extent. But also what that does of creating that simulated experience is emphasize the fact that it's not real. So while that might be useful for assessment, it's not necessarily useful or an accurate predictor of what's going to happen differently back in the workplace, because people can pass the simulated assessment and not change their behavior back in the workplace. Now, I'm informed here by a couple of pieces of work. One, a report by Towards Maturity called How to Build and Change Habits in the Workplace, which is really worth a read, and I recommend it to you. And the second is the Learning Transfer Evaluation Model created by Will Thalheimer. And what Will Thalheimer says is that decision-making and task competence may be able to be checked at the end of a learning intervention or the end of a process through the use of simulations, through the use of special tasks that people do out with the workplace. But in actual fact, in order to measure transfer and to really define the return on investment to the organization of their initiative, you need people to do things in the workplace and to be observed doing it. And of course, assessment is part of that, but it's not assessment in the sense of, let's see if you pass the test and get a tick in the box. It's assessment which is part of workplace transfer primarily to support coaching, to support continued development planning, and most importantly, to give people an objective view against which they can then frame their own reflections. And we know that reflective learning is really important. So we want people to try things out for real in the real workplace, get some feedback, and then be able to reflect on that experience, to think about what they still need to do differently, and to plan action to continue their development. So workplace transfer might be tricky, might be difficult to organize, might be resource hungry. What it can't be is optional.
Our learning experiences unlock potential, transform the performance of people and organisations, and help millions around the world build happy and successful careers. We change lives with evidence-based learning that works, sparking real change for real impact.
Welcome to another session where Martin and I look at a current research report. And today Martin has chosen the Leo Oblique Watershed report. And its short title, there's an even longer title, the short title is 5 Years of Measuring the Business Impact of Learning. So what is 5 years of measuring the business impact of learning? Tell us, Martin. And is it interesting?
Well, this year, of course, it's been a slightly different year for pretty much every organisation. So a headline number is 40.6% of respondents have said that COVID has caused them to focus on operational changes over measurement. So in actual fact, measurement's kind of taken second place to everything else this year, which may be a good or a bad thing when we consider the fact that 60% feel executive pressure to measure the impact of learning, which is up from 35% when this research report first started 5 years ago. So we've got COVID, that's basically shifted attention away from measurement, and yet there is still an executive level need for L&D to be measuring impact. So that's the kind of broad picture. The data then has a look at kind of the barriers to measuring impact. I mean, I think 95% of respondents want to be measuring impact. So this isn't something that people don't want to do. It most definitely is on the agenda. But when you look at the barriers, you've got competing priorities is the biggest barrier. Don't know where to start, I don't know how to start rather, is the second. And no access to the data is third. And they're quite fundamental things, aren't they? If you've got competing priorities, I completely understand that in the last year that we've had. But remember that there is organizational pressure to show the value here. That hasn't gone away. That's becoming a greater and greater pressure as years go on. So the idea that actually we're still too busy on other things, I don't know how long that's going to wash as a decent excuse. The idea that we don't know how to start is, well, we can actually do something about that. That might be quite alarming. It might be a wake-up call, but the fact is that people don't know how to do it. And the idea of also that there's no access to the data is shocking. A learning team not being able to access the data it needs to show value. That
Absolutely agree.
So if that's you in your organisation, then please use this report to go and start
banging on a few doors,
executives, so that you can get what you need. Now, I think
if you look at there's a graph at the back. I actually found the annexes more interesting than the report, to be honest, because they've got the real data. The report just glosses over everything very, very briefly. It's only about 10 pages. But the success of my department is evaluated by, we're not evaluated, still in 2021, over 10%, 12% of organisations are not evaluated. And that isn't massively different from 2017, when it was about 15%. So you'd think that with COVID, with all the pressures, that would have been down to 1 or 2%. And the way organisations are evaluated, guess what? Our good old friend learner satisfaction is there at 30%, well above anything else in the organisation or in the list. And that is up on 2020. So if there's pressure to evaluate, people have rushed in and said, well, we better find out what the learners think. Oh, they all love it. That's great. We've done a great job. But ROI is staying steady at about the same, 12%. Organisational impact is down to about 18%. And improvement in job performance is kind of constant as well, about 12, 13%. So it's a slightly disappointing picture. There's no great trajectory apart from in measuring the most useless stuff of all, which is learner satisfaction. And we're making no big chunk out of the relatively large number of organisations that are not evaluated at all. So, you have to say, if you compare these two reports, you have to say the evidence for the former report, why do businesses not really respect their L&D departments? The answer to that is very firmly in the data that Leo have pulled together in this report. So the two actually work very well, last month's and this month. So Martin, you've done very well to have selected two reports that in some ways kind of have a dialogue with each other. And at least we're having the dialogue. They don't explicitly do that. And therefore they should be read in partnership and conjunction. Don't you agree?
I do. I think it's kind of what becomes interesting when you look at some of these reports is that they do start to tell a story, and these stories seem to build a bit of a narrative. And here we're talking about measurement, and in terms of the previous report we looked at, we're talking about perception and impact. So actually, there is something in here which I think everyone in learning and development will be familiar with. It's that whole proving your value, showing your value, proving your worth. That's not new. And these reports are showing that there's still work to be done. And I think in this particular report, that idea that people are saying they don't know how to start, I think that's, I think it's really honest of people. It's 2021. We don't know how. We know we want to do it, but we don't know how to measure impact.
That's
So
20%. 20% say it's too hard. They don't know how to start. And then another 15% say it's too hard. And yet, if you go to the graph before, and it's I feel executive pressure to measure learning's impact, strongly agree or agree is up at 70%. So people are feeling the pressure and they find it too hard, have competing priorities, or don't know what to do. That is quite astonishing. There's a massive gap of expectation arising here. The output of that, what will fall out at the other end, is generally executives saying we've got pretty poor L&D in this place. Doesn't seem to be really coming to grips with what we want. So I think they're very salutary, both of those reports, and you should read them. This Leo report, the screen grab, will give you the address. It's free. Download it, read it, and learn from it, just as the previous program when we looked at the report by Emerald Works. So, Martin, final last words?
I think the fact that people are still having difficulty knowing how to do this does actually suggest that measuring impact of learning is potentially quite a tricksy thing to do. Otherwise, everyone would have worked it out and there would be one way of doing it. There is no one way of doing it. There are no industry standards around this. It's all work in progress. So I think you have to see that as the context here. I think it is salutary though. So I think there is work to be done. And I think people need to really start getting their hands dirty on figuring out what measurement and impact and value look like in their organisation.
Completely agree. It's a perfect place to leave it. So thanks for choosing those reports, Martin. That was a very useful conversation, I thought.
Thank you.
Now it's time for our monthly roundup of all the latest learning news with none other than Rob Clark from Learning News.
I'm Rob Clark. This is Learning News and a roundup of popular stories on Learning News. A survey from Training Industry has found that organisations are seeing increased satisfaction with their learning management system, reversing recent trends. And the average Net Promoter scores have bounced back from a low in 2018 of -57 to +9. I'm joined by Gordon Johnson from Totara, one of the brands which the survey looked at.
The early learning management systems were really developed to be a tool for an LMS administrator. These new products started coming out called learning experience platforms, and they were, in theory, supposed to be more focused on the learner. LMSs picked up on that. And they said, oh, we can build that into our product, right? And that's a good example is Totara. We have a product now called Totara Engage. It's basically a learning experience platform that's built into the product. And other LMSs have done this. And I think in general, other learning management systems, other learning technology has become more learner focused. And one other quick reason, everything is about SaaS products, software as a service, to where it's really easy basically to get rid of software now when it didn't used to be. On-resident software was not easy. If it's easier to get rid of software, then you have to deliver a good product, basically, and the highest customer satisfaction.
Learning analytics remains one of the top priorities for learning and development professionals, again listed in the top 3 of this year's Global Sentiment Survey. Yet L&D professionals say it's something they find difficult to do. Learning Pool is attempting to help solve the problem by integrating the AI-driven business intelligence tool SciSense into its learning systems product. It believes that SciSense can help its clients to gain better insights more easily into their learning programs.
We hope that our partnership with SciSense solves a few problems. Our clients' data maturity is really growing, both in terms of what the learning professionals want from their learning data in order to make decisions, but also in terms of what their wider businesses want from them. But alongside that, the second thing is that they haven't really become data scientists or suddenly have more access to advanced IT skills. So they haven't always been able to do exactly what they wanted to do. They often don't have access to a proper BI tool. So BI tools have now been around a long time. Most larger businesses are going to have one or more, but they're not always accessible to the learning and development team. And even if they are, the people who look after the BI tool may not be specialists in learning analytics or understand what learning and development really want to see. So yeah, the idea is we bring all of that together and solve the problem.
Learning the lessons from serious child safeguarding incidents and improving responses to families and children made national news over the past few weeks, following an increase in cases of serious child abuse over the last year. A team from London Borough of Sutton, together with Virtual College, has launched a new online toolkit and series of e-learning modules to help all those involved improve their responses to families and children.
The e-learning modules are actually drawn on the lived experiences of children and young people from across the country, from awareness training to greater in-depth training for those with substantial responsibilities, and a whole repository of up-to-date legislation and guidance for all those who come in contact with children and young people. So whether they be students and trainees, frontline practitioners, designated safeguarding leads, managers, senior leaders, head teachers, academics, and the judiciary.
Learning Technologies Group last year acquired 3 companies in the Moodle open source LMS market. OpenLMS, itself the world's biggest Moodle provider, and 2 further Moodle services businesses, eCreators in Australia and eThink in the US. LTG's aim is to build a Moodle technology and services business that helps corporate learning and education providers move Moodle into the cloud and tap into the expected significant growth of the open source Moodle LMS market.
What we've seen is a possible expansion of this market, and there are certainly some people predicting that the open source area could easily expand quite substantially. And it fits our kind of thinking about having product companies and service companies at the same time. But what's I think really interesting is that we're in a world now where corporate world is saying, look, education is not preparing people well enough to come into the corporate world and be ready. There is a gap between education and what the workplace actually requires that we can see. And we think that's going to be a very interesting hinterland in the future for vocational training of one sort or another, which has got to be a mix between the top end of education and whatever it is that workplace is doing in order to prepare people. But fundamentally, we just believe wholly in the open source area of the market and see it as a great area to be in.
You can see my full interview with Piers Lee from LTG on Learning News, along with the CEO of OpenLMS, Phil Miller, discussing OpenLMS's plans and product roadmap. And there's more from each of the people and stories featured in today's bulletin. Thanks for watching. See you next time.
Maybe we'll do that later. Hey, so you can see, this is just like using a whiteboard in a classroom. And then you do my 3-year-old's favourite, you just have a nice little wiggle. 1, 2, 3, rate it now.
A really quick question, you might want to answer this later.
You see, I love this.
It's always a pleasure to talk to Becky Norman. Becky is the editor of Training Zone and HR Zone. Big job, 2 big websites to manage. But I wanted to start by saying, first of all, welcome to Learning Now TV, Becky. It's a pleasure to see you, see your face. I usually see you on email rather than face to face. And just to ask you, how has it been in the last year? What about the pandemic? Has it increased the traffic to Training and HR Zone, or has it been more difficult to connect with people because they're all dispersed and not in their normal settings? How's it been going?
Hi, Nigel. Well, first, thank you so much for inviting me here today. It's a pleasure. HR Zone and Training Zone, they're both publications that have been around for around 20 years. They're both digital publications, and our main focus is providing insights, guidance and opinion for senior HR and L&D professionals to help them with current issues and overcoming their challenges within their work. In terms of the pandemic, we were quite quick to respond by providing content to support them with all the change that they were going through. We created these hubs, these central focus points where our audience could go to for advice on various issues, around transitioning to remote learning, virtual learning, or on the HR side, moving, whole workforces to home working or furlough. There was a lot of focus, there was a lot of traffic heading to those areas of the site, as they were obviously, in need of guidance and support there.
So you were trying to be helpful friends to the community rather than
yes.
Indifferent to their plight. And I guess you had to transition too.
Yeah.
So Training Zone and HR Zone also moved out of their offices, and you were working remotely. So you had a pretty clear understanding of what it was like to work in a completely different way.
Yes, absolutely. I've been working from my kitchen for the past year, so as many people have.
Like many people, indeed.
Yeah.
So what are we going to announce? Well, what is it that you've launched that we want to share with everybody watching the programme?
Yeah, so we launched last year the Culture Pioneers Initiative, and this was really around spreading positivity in a difficult time and showcasing the amazing work of people and learning practitioners who were, really dedicated to nurturing and strengthening their company culture in response to the pandemic. And we've received some really inspiring stories across a range of industries and different organisational sizes who, had the same ultimate challenge of dealing with the crisis, but approached it in very unique ways that, worked for their business and their people. So following the success of that and the calibre of stories we received from that, we decided to evolve this year into an awards programme. And this is going to be championing the HR and L&D leaders who are, on that journey to creating a better culture for their organisation and their people.
It's a great initiative, by the way. I think we should acknowledge the people who are on that journey. It's not an easy journey, and often. So yeah, go on. I didn't want to interrupt you.
No, absolutely. And yeah, something that it is important to flag, we're not simply wanting to celebrate the best. And, can you really say what is the best culture? It's unique to every business. But what we're looking for is, those businesses and people that are committed to that ongoing change and are starting to see some progress there.
So you're asking for people to share their stories with you, essentially?
Yeah. And we have 4 categories this year. So last year we were just kind of inviting people to share their stories. This year we have categories. So we have a learning category, and we also have wellbeing, inclusion and innovation. And we're inviting both teams and individuals from UK businesses to get involved.
That's great. So how do they do that? Well, if I'm listening to this and thinking, oh yeah, I could share a story or two. How do I do that?
So you can head to the website, which the URL is on the screen now. And we will be open for entries between the 4th of May and the 23rd of July. So all the information and the link to enter is all there. And I'd also recommend downloading the entry guide, which will also be available from the 4th of May, which has lots of kind of tips and useful hints from the judges themselves on what they're looking for from entries.
And Becky, if I enter, I'll get the possibility of winning an award. So is it just one for each category or many for each category? And I'll get some helpful comments from the judge about what they liked about what we were doing in our organisation. Is that right? So there's a kind of bang for every buck, so that every single person will get, the very least, will get some feedback from the judging panel. Is that correct?
Absolutely, yeah. So we will be providing feedback from the judges. We will also be announcing finalists in October, and they will get kind of a little spotlight on them before a month later on the 18th of November, we'll be announcing the winners, and we'll have some kind of virtual awards on the 18th of November to celebrate those.
You're really looking for a diversity of perspective and viewpoint to make the awards really zing. Is that correct?
Absolutely. Organisations of all sizes, from all sectors, whether you're just doing it by yourself as an individual, whether there's a team of you. Yeah, exactly. We want diversity of stories. And, we find that it's not just those with big budgets and a big transformation project that make the biggest of impacts necessarily. Last year, we had a charity, the Brain Tumour Charity, who, didn't have much budget, but they came together, got really creative to support their people and their culture through the crisis. So sometimes it's just creativity that can make a really big impact with culture. Yeah. So don't let that stop you getting involved.
Good. So as many people as possible with as many varied stories as possible. Just click on the link and get your entry in sometime between the opening and the closing date. Becky Norman, it's been a real pleasure to talk to you, and I wish you luck. I hope it's a very successful programme this year, and we get some sensational winners that you will be showcasing, undoubtedly, in both Training Zone and HR Zone. So thank you, Becky. Thanks for your time.
Thanks, Nigel. It's great to be here.
Debbie Carter has retired from the Training Journal after 20 years at the helm. Pretty impressive, 20 years, a whole lifetime of changes in media as well as in training and development. And we thought at LNTV that it would be very churlish of us not to recognise Debbie for her contribution and just pay tribute to her in an LNTV interview. So this is your space, Debbie, and we're very, very pleased that you should come to join us today.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me, Nigel. It's a pleasure to share some history and some insights with your audience. So thank you for that.
First of all, let's just talk about Training Journal. How has Training Journal changed, morphed over those years?
Well, quite dramatically in the last 12 months, of course, because our print edition has gone and we are purely a digital community now. I'm surprised, actually, it didn't happen earlier in many ways, but perhaps that's another story. Training Journal has been around for a long time. It was first published in 1965, as you probably know. And when I started working on it, it had just changed its name from Training Officer, which was its original title when it was part of Marylebone Press. And originally it had been the magazine of the old ITD. But after a year, it became completely independent and has remained so ever since. although we've been through major acquisitions and mergers in the years I've been there. But when we first started, it was a black and white, very dull looking magazine, but full of really great how-to material, largely around the skills agenda and training, a bit of soft skills. And when we bought it, we decided, that was Fenman who bought it originally, they decided it had to have a revamp. So we went colour, new layout, and it was really a great new publication in its appearance, and with the new name, of course, too. We also, at the time, we had a small email, an online forum called UKHRD, which I think was probably one of the first communities online for L&D people, and that we kind of worked together a little bit. And then when the Training Journal website started to develop, then the forum became part of that, and that was, until quite recently, a major part of the community. But with the advent of social media, it didn't really seem necessary for us to have our own social platform any longer. So yeah, it's gone through quite a lot of changes. We had the awards, which were introduced and ran for about 15 years, something like that. But unfortunately, again, our publishers have decided that we can't run them. They're not actually viable for us in an already very busy marketplace.
So what do you think your greatest contribution to the journal over the years that you were in charge, essentially?
Well, I think it's just tenacity and hanging on in. We went through some very tough periods, especially when we were acquired, when we became part of Dodd's Parliamentary Communication, and the whole operation was going to move to London, and I had the option then of, did I want to carry on or not? Was I willing to commute? Which I said I wouldn't commute daily, because as a wheelchair user, it's actually a logistical nightmare to do a journey almost every day, and then travel across London to various offices. So I said no, but I managed to negotiate to work flexibly. So I've been working flexibly now, about 15, 20 years, well, on and off 15 or 20 years. So that worked well for me. So that's for me was an achievement. The awards, I think, was probably for me the biggest achievement, because we started from nothing and grew it very quickly to something that was highly recognised in the field.
And highly respected as well.
Yeah, and also I think the reason I feel proud of it was because it was celebrating the practitioner effort as opposed to supplier. Not that I've got any objection to that, but it was just nice that we were still representing our practitioners, our profession. And also it was a great exercise in reflective learning, sitting down and thinking, well, what have we done well? It is something that most organisations probably don't do enough.
Couldn't agree more.
You know, thinking about, I was listening to Martin Cousin's exploration of the Emerald Works and Mind Tools Leaders and L&D research on your last broadcast, and I thought there was a great synergy there with some of this, that if we don't tell our story properly and we don't actually sit down and think about, well, how have we measured this? How do we show it's made an impact? How do we're not going to have, it's a way of starting those conversations with the leaders in the organisation to say, look, we do make a difference. So that for me, that was a key part of what TJ was trying to do. Always, think about your business first, not what you're doing, but is what you're doing contributing to the bottom line? And I think there's some still struggle with that, I'm afraid, which is
sadly after all these years.
That's what the research is saying leaders think about L&D, and I find that very disheartening, because we've been talking about this almost since I started. You've got to love the business before anything else. You've got to be out there in the business solving their problems. And I still think it's something that a lot of L&D people shy away from for some reason. And I think they'll have to change because they won't have that role. It'll become a marketing role, an IT role probably. So,
True. Yeah. True. What about your greatest influence? Who or what influenced you most strongly over the years? Is there any consistent influence you could put your finger on?
Influence or influencer?
Both.
I think people in the industry have always inspired me. I mean, I've just said, a lot of people aren't in the right steps in their organisations, but as people, L&D are incredibly kind and very, again, time back to your last broadcast, with lots of empathy. And as a disabled person who had 20 years of working in other organisations before working in L&D, my experiences have been less than the best. And when I moved into an industry where people actually took notice of you and were kind to you or had empathy with your situation, was quite an eye-opener for me. So as a group of people, they influenced me, and I hope I influenced them in some ways, but they influenced me about the importance of empathy, kindness, putting yourself in other people's shoes, how we don't do that enough. And I think that's something that if we all did it, we'd have a much better place.
Final question, really. Any tips, both for the industry and for young John sitting there anxiously with his notepad poised? Any tips for the industry?
Well, I think increasingly, as COVID has shown us, we need a combination of good collaborative skills, empathy and kindness, an ability to and an imagination to think about what might happen, and try not to have any limits to that imagination. I was talking with my son the other day about AI and robots, and a few years ago, I think people would never have talked about AI as we do now, about the things that it is able to do. And I said, well, we wondered about, there are people talking about how consciousness could be replicated and whether that's a possibility. I said, well, we don't think it now, but I'm sure it may happen. And who's to say that isn't the next evolutionary step for mankind? I just don't, let's not restrict our imagination so that we can all manage and survive whatever the future brings, because it is so complex now. I think kindness and our creativity as human beings will tide us over very nicely.
It's a great note to leave on: kindness, empathy, and optimism for the future.
Yeah.
And we all, I think everyone at LNTV wishes you the very best for your future as well. So thank you so much for talking to us and sharing us. Good, and congratulations on 20 years at the helm. That's a pretty major achievement. You've come through, the ups and downs of a very volatile industry, and you've survived, come through COVID as well. So all the best for the future. Nice to talk to you, Debbie. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nigel.
What did you think of the show, Kate? What sort of struck me very forcibly this time is that we're gradually, slowly but surely, broadening away from just a pure focus on learning. For example, I like the idea that training zone has come together with HR zone. Conveniently, they have the same editor, but coming together to focus on cultural pioneers. And Dana with her focus on equity, inclusion and diversity really important stuff. And obviously learning is part of that, it's integral, but that's not the whole picture. We're getting a broader view of talent and people in organisations coming through. Would you agree, Kate?
A million percent. I think the more that we can get away from this notion of, you know, training and learning is something that is being done to people. You know, it is something that happens in organizations all the time, but it also fits into a much bigger picture. You know, how does it fit into the overall talent and HR priorities, and how does it fit into the overall business priorities as well, especially in these tough times where businesses are having to make, you know, some tough decisions. So yeah, I think that where learning fits into the bigger picture, and some of the work that our guests today have talked about, is fundamental. And I think that, you know, it's a joy to be part of bringing that message, you know, to our viewers as part of Learning Now TV.
Let's keep it up, eh? Let's keep it up for May, and then June, and then July. So we'll see you again in May. And really great point, Kate. Thank you very much.
Thanks for watching.